Welcome to the Practical Enneagram. It was soon apparent to me during this interview with head coach and founder of fifth generation coaching school, Alethia, that Steve March is an incredibly gifted, multidisciplinary coach. If I hadn't already shelled out thousands of pounds on coaches training, I would probably train at Steve's school. As it is, I'm going to make myself content with this interview for now. Steve March doesn't do most of the Enneagram coaching interventions out there. In fact, he thinks a lot of them do more harm than good. What then is exactly his evolution in Enneagram-based coaching that sits within his coaching methodology? That's what this interview is about. I heartily recommend that you listen closely to his incredibly spiritual perspectives on coaching and how to support a client's development or unfolding, as he calls it. I left with a lot of thought-provoking content, but maybe the most widely applicable idea from Steve here is that it is possible to use the Enneagram in a light touch way in the process of supporting our clients. Contrary to a lot of the other messaging out there, we don't, as coaches, need to know the Enneagram in depth in order to use it in the most beneficial way. Anyway, encourage you to listen to this whole thing, possibly twice. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. It's springtime here in California. I love getting outdoors, and I've been able to do that recently. Just finished a cycle of classes. So I'm now in the middle of a kind of hiatus for the next month and a half of not teaching. And so I'm looking in my schedule and it just looks like open and free and perfect timing to get outdoors and enjoy things and before the next classes start in June. So
do you like that? Do you like open spaces in your schedule?
I do. I'm really trying to get myself on this schedule where I teach and coach for 6 months, and then I take off 2 months, and then I teach and coach for 6 months and take off 2 months. So that nice. There can be a kind of balance. There's this really, for me, a challenge because I really love my work. And my work is also playful for me. And this is one of the things I think happens for people who are living in this more integrated lifestyle. And I can really enjoy all this work. But then once in a while, I'll wake up and realize, actually, I think I've been playing all this time. And actually, I've been working all this time and haven't taken enough of a break.
That's a good problem to have, though.
It's a great problem to have, but it is a problem. And it will need to be addressed.
For sure. So get some unwinding time, hopefully, for the next few weeks.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for doing this. I'm delighted to get the opportunity to speak with you about this stuff. As I mentioned to you, I've been listening to an interview you did with Joel Monk at Coaches Rising in, I think it was 2018. And I learned that I'm basically now at a juncture that you were once yourself at over 20 years ago, as far as I understood it from that interview, when you emerged from your integral coaching training with New Ventures West. I came out of my coaching training with Integral Coaching Canada, experiencing myself as not yet fully resourced as a coach. And so a bit like you and a bit not like you, I spent the last 12 months getting Enneagram training. You, on the other hand, living in San Francisco, got a lot of interesting and cutting edge developmental and therapeutic training modalities. You went to, I think, the Strozzi Institute for their somatic training. You learned internal family systems, and then presumably at some point at that time encountered the Enneagram.
I think that exactly how you said it is how I experienced it. I graduated my coach training, which was a fantastic program. I learned a lot. And yet at the same time, after that year of intensive study, I also had a sense that I wasn't really prepared to be able to deal with anything that could come up in a coaching conversation. And I really felt, probably like every other coach at that juncture, that I just needed more training. I needed some different kinds of skills. And so, I went off and learned a bunch of different things, took training in focusing and really deepened into my own spiritual practice and the diamond approach, lots of different things, and wound up with a kind of eclectic practice of all these different things, and was starting to fumble with them and integrate them and work with them. And that was, probably about 8 years after my coach training of just continuing to learn, to work, and all of that.
Wow. So you had a lot in your toolkit.
Yeah, that's right.
And then it seemed to me like you founded Alethea eventually out of a need to bring coherence to all of these tools that you had at your disposal.
That's right. There's, as I said, I had like this eclectic practice, and the way I would work with clients, which I think is probably how most coaches in that period of their development coaches, they would learn about a client and think, maybe a little bit of parts work with this client, or maybe some focusing with this client, or maybe some somatic work with this client, or even in the midst of a coaching engagement, getting the engagement to a certain point and then saying, okay, now I think we're ready for somatic work, making these transitions. And in a way it worked, but in a way it was clumsy and didn't work. And I think sometimes confusing for the client and sometimes confusing for me, like having almost too many choices, too many options.
Yeah.
And I think it was in the late 2000s, probably close to 2010 or so, I had a big integrating insight. The insight came out of resting in a question, which was, I'd learned all these methods, but they were all so different. And at first that startled me because I was expecting, maybe naively, that we're all coaching human beings. So probably we all have variations on a theme. But that's not what I found. I found is just radical diversity of methodologies, and they all worked. And I was like, well, how can that be? What's going on with human beings that all of these methods work and they're all so different? But I also noticed that all of these methods fail to work sometimes too. And I really wondered why. And the integrating insight that I came up with out of sitting in that question for many years, actually, was that they all work at different depths. And this was the origin of a model that I now teach in the Alethia school that I founded, called the 4 depths. And I could see pretty quickly which methodologies were specialists at which depth, and when a client is at that depth, that methodology works really well. But when a client is not at that depth, it's a kind of mismatch. And so that methodology will fail to work. And being an integrally minded fellow, I began to wonder, could there be a methodology that actually understood depth as its foundational integrating concept, and then actually worked with a client in real time, right in the moment, at the depth that they were presenting at, and with the methodology that would work? So I had to actually change a lot of these different methods to be able to integrate into something that was a seamless flow between depths. And my first attempt was to think that maybe a coaching engagement would start at a shallower depth and then sort of graduate on to a deeper depth. And I would switch methods, and then we would work some more, and we would graduate to a still deeper depth. Except that when I tried to do that, that's not what actually happened. What happened was, even in a single coaching conversation, we were visiting multiple depths, up and down, back and forth, in a very nonlinear way. And as we would practice that again and again over the course of the coaching engagement, the client would start to more consciously inhabit more of themselves, more of their depth, more of their resourcefulness, more of their creativity, more of their genius. So I let go of trying to orchestrate a particular path and instead just respond to them in real time in a way that helps them to relate to what's unfolding for them.
In a way, it takes a lot of courage to let go of the linear route like that, hey?
It does. One of the things I've actually come to really love about this style of coaching is that most of the time as a coach, I'm sitting and not knowing. I'm not exactly sure where this conversation needs to go. The only thing I know is, or the only thing I can inquire into, is what's here right now. And oftentimes there's more here than what's been consciously owned and felt and brought into the conversation. So we can just continue to say, well, and how do you feel about that? Or where do you feel that in your body? Or, is it okay to feel that? And the client thinks, actually, I'm really uncomfortable feeling that. Then I can say, well, what's uncomfortable about that? We can explore that discomfort, and the conversation seems to unfold, not because I'm steering the conversation, but because I'm simply being present and inviting the client to be present.
Yeah, I would love to hear, and we will hear more about the 4 depths. But before we go there, and and learn as well where the Enneagram fits into things. I'd love to know when you found the Enneagram and what you experienced when you did.
First time I came across the Enneagram was just by reference in a book that I was reading, written by Ken Wilber, the late 90s.
Mm-hmm.
And when I encountered it, I didn't know anything about it. And then probably about a year, maybe a year and a half later, I wound up in the New Ventures West coach training. And in the first session of that course, they introduced the Enneagram in a kind of light way and then go around and type everyone.
Mm-hmm.
And that was really the first time that I had really gotten a sense of it. And their training isn't an Enneagram training per se, but it does introduce a lot of people, myself included, to the Enneagram. So at first it was complex. And I actually, in the middle of that year of intense training, I decided to put it to the side because it was just too much to learn this very sophisticated model and do that training at the same time.
Yeah.
Some people do it differently. They do them both at the same time, but I didn't. And the year after I graduated, that's when I really started to lean into the Enneagram and look at it and explore it, and really just see how sophisticated a view it is. It really offers a lot of distinctions that can help us to sense into our clients and to learn about human nature. We can talk more about this, but I do think it's possible to use the Enneagram, even if you don't feel like you understand it really well, to sort of begin to get into it, begin to explore it. Over the last 20 years that I've been working with the Enneagram, what I've learned to use it as is more like a mirror. I look at the Enneagram like a mirror, like we look in a mirror to be able to see the color of our eyes, because otherwise we can't see them. So the whole idea of looking in a mirror is being able to see something about yourself, getting a perspective on yourself that you otherwise can't have. And the Enneagram offers that. So we look in this mirror and we see reflected back to us facets of our fixation.
Yeah.
And we can go, oh, yeah, I think I do that, or I do feel that, or I do have that motivation. That is such a helpful thing to do. And then we actually can work with that.
Yeah. And this ties in nicely to the 4 depths. Can we begin to go through them now? And before that, can you maybe say a little bit about what Alethia, the coaching method, is?
So Alethia is, I believe, a next generation methodology that is essentially supportive of our clients' deepening unfoldment. And it is a developmental methodology that is centered on relationship and working in real time with exactly what's arising in the present moment in a way that deepens the client's self-contact and contact with their environment, with relationships, and especially deepening into innate resourcefulness, innate creativity, innate genius, the kinds of connections and contact that's immediately available. And I find that essentially what we're doing in a coaching conversation is we're actually practicing something. So it's a practice that we do with our clients. And through doing this practice, we're practicing emotional awareness and somatic awareness and relational awareness. And we're practicing embodying resources as we uncover them. Many coaching approaches focus on offering practices for clients to do outside the coaching conversation. And I've done that kind of coaching for a long time. And what I repeatedly found is that clients struggle to do their practices. And so in Alethia coaching, we actually practice something right in the coaching conversation using this 4 depths model that actually helps us to go deeper and deeper and deeper.
Beautiful. Thank you. And then would you be happy to run through the 4 depths?
Yeah. So the shallowest depth is what I call the depth of parts. And even as I'm talking through this, just, feel into this, because these depths are right here, right now. You can look at the world around you from the perspective of depth. You can look at the world inside of you. You can understand the body from the perspective of depth. So this depth, when we're attuned to this depth, the dominant experiences of separation, like I'm looking, here at the stuff, and I've got my coffee here and a glass of water here, and there's a microphone here and the computer here, and all of that is separate from each other, and it's separate from me and separate from you. So there's this sense of separation, but I can also look inward to myself and notice I have a certain felt sense in my belly, and that's separate from the thoughts I'm thinking. It's separate from maybe the mood I have or the emotions that I have. So I can notice separation even within myself. And what we do in Alethia is we adapt internal family systems therapy and some of the distinctions from that, which are also more broadly in things like voice dialogue and Jungian subpersonalities. This idea that inwardly we have many different parts. This is a very skillful way to actually understand the complexity of our ego structure, or we could say it in Enneagram terms, the complexity of our fixation. The fixation is actually a constellation of parts.
Right, yeah.
And we can understand that complexity and begin to work with it in a bite-sized way by working part by part by part.
But can you say more about that piece? The Enneagram is a constellation of parts, and there's this sense that I'm getting that working at the parts depth, there's an integration between the Enneagram and internal family systems.
Yeah, that's right. So an Enneagram fixation is a constellation of parts. And parts, there are, broadly speaking, two kinds of parts. There are protector parts, which are defensive, that help us to protect us from feeling hurt. And there are parts that feel hurt. And so we have both of those kinds of parts. And according to the research that I'm familiar with, the average psychologically healthy adult has between 30 and 50 parts. So we're actually quite complex on the inside. And I think this is one of the reasons why I'm such a fan of working in the particular. And I think this is one of the things I want to communicate in this interview, is that the Enneagram is beautiful and sophisticated of view. And it can really, if we look in that mirror, we can go, oh yeah, I can see elements of my fixation that maybe I was blind to. But in fact, when we go to work with that, it's better, in my opinion and experience, to shift into the particular, where we actually work with the very parts that compose our fixation. Because what we find is that two people with the same type don't actually have the same constellation of parts, that there's something particular in how the type manifests in each one of us that we switch into that.
Can you give me an example of how that looks, Steve? Is that possible?
It's a little challenging to give an example, but just think of it in this way. Given these two types of parts, the protector parts and the hurt parts, all of us have experienced being hurt in certain ways. I'm immediately thinking of times in my life when I was a little boy, on the playground and having the basketball stolen from me by other kids that wanted to play with it, and how much I felt sort of pushed out of the group. Right. Well, that's not that can't happen to anyone, but that's my memory. And so when I work with that feeling of rejection or that feeling of not belonging, that comes up in the particular. Actually helping our clients to work with those kinds of particular memories, the way it actually manifests for them, is where it can be most powerful. That's the idea, is that we all have different life histories. Yeah. And it's working with that actual situation, that with that particular way that those parts, the particular memories they have, the particular strategies that they adopted, where we actually find all of this uniqueness. So really, I think the Enneagram is a beautiful thing to work with, but we have to hold it. We have to hold this balance between the universality of the Enneagram and the particular way that the fixation manifests in each one of us. And I believe we can actually leverage both together. They complement each other.
Right. Does the coach tend to use the Enneagram as a diving board for the inquiry into the way that, say, not belonging manifested in the individual, or does it happen the other way round?
So let me give you an example of a recent CEO that I worked with. This is a CEO, founder of a company. He is looking to step out, to retire within the next 5 years, and he's starting to prepare himself and the company to do that. So I'm working with him through that transition. And so I had him take the Enneagram Institute RETI test, which is a very common, test. And if you're familiar with that test, the results that you get back, it doesn't tell you what type you are. It probably wouldn't be wise to do that. But it basically says, statistically speaking, these are the top 3 types that were presented in your answers. And it gives some quite detailed descriptions, many pages for each type. So the outcome, the output is many pages. I forget now how many, 10 or 15 pages of a report. So what I do is I had him basically print that out and walk through it, and to have a highlighter present and to highlight anything that it said for any of those 3 types that he resonated with. He said, yes, that's me. That's what I do. And of course, he highlighted things on all 3 types. And then I said, which of these are going to be the biggest inner impediments to making this transition out of the company that you're going to face? And it turned out he didn't choose 3 in one type. They were spread over, in fact, in this case, it was 2 types. So we used the Enneagram like a mirror. He looked in it, he could see something, and he could see, oh, this is really going to be an issue. So we took one of those inner impediments, and then we switched into the particular. Right. So I said, so there's a part of you that does that. One of the types that came up was a type 3. And he had this drive towards efficiency. And so I said, well, why do you think this is going to be an impediment? And we started to talk about this for a while. And what came out, and I sort of helped him with this view, was to recognize that efficiency is a really good thing when it comes to working with machines, not such a good thing when it comes to working with people, right? And so there was a way in which he was constantly leaving meetings thinking, was that an efficient use of time, right? Except that there were some meetings where he was having to have difficult conversations with employees, and those conversations, as we probably know as coaches, are very emotional. They take their own time. They take what they do. And so efficiency is really not the way to say, was that a good conversation?
Right. It's the wrong benchmark, isn't it?
It's the wrong benchmark for that. But he has this part that's driving for efficiency, right? And a lot of what he was facing were having to have a lot of personal conversations with people in the company to reorganize the company to step forward in that way. So we worked with this part that has this drive towards efficiency. Now, here's the key with parts work. When you work with a part, you approach the part with no agenda to change it. And this is a radical thing for many coaches, and actually for many clients as well. So what we want to do is to be able to work with this part so that its good intentions are seen, understood, loved, and valued exactly as they are. And so what's efficiency about? How is that trying to help him? And how is that trying to protect him from feeling hurt? So we worked with that. And what happens when a part feels seen, understood, loved, and valued exactly as it is, it softens, it relaxes. And if I could take us back to the 4 depths for a moment, that's actually what has us drop deeper in depth.
Right.
So when we work with the part without trying to change it, but just helping it to feel seen and understood and valued as it is, something in the part just relaxes. And if you think for a moment, like if you've ever felt seen in a relationship with a friend, a family member, a partner, it's like when we feel that, we feel seen, there's usually one of 2 things that happens. Usually it's something in us that just releases and lets go. Maybe we didn't even know was tight. Oh, yeah, I don't have to do anything. I can just rest in this. They get me. The other thing that sometimes happens is we shine. So it's like, just imagine like a little kid that, does a drawing for mommy and brings the drawing to mommy and says, Mommy, look at this. I drew this for you. And the mommy hopefully says, wow, that's amazing. And the kid just beams, it's like, oh, I feel seen. I feel loved. So what we do is we do that with our parts instead of trying to say, stop having this agenda to be so efficient. It doesn't work with people. And what happens is that relaxes and we drop into the next step down with this, which is the depth of process. This is a depth of the flow of felt experience. So things are more fluid here, and they require that relaxing of structure to move into that. This is a place of lots of dynamic unfoldment. Suddenly, we've really now dropped into a depth where the client can really develop at this point, because the rigidity of parts blocks that development. And we could say because parts are composing of fixations, that fixations block development. So by doing this, we actually work directly with the fixation in a way that softens it and moves the client into deeper self-contact at the depth of process. Then we just follow that process by feeling the bodily felt sense. Sometimes there's felt imagery that comes up in the mind, emotion, and we simply feel that. And there is something that flow of felt experience is headed in a productive direction. It's not random. It's actually headed in the direction towards the realization of our own innate wholeness. And so we practice something in Alethia coaching called process work. We do parts work at the depth of parts. We do process work at the depth of process. And the last move of process work, we have a way of actually helping the client drop even deeper into the depth of presence, which is the third depth. The depth of presence is where we drop into our innate wholeness. We actually feel whole and complete. In fact, one of the questions that I often ask when I believe clients are there is, does it feel like anything is missing? And it's often shocking and surprising to them because they check and they go, no, nothing feels missing. Now, that doesn't mean we're omnipotent or anything like that. Of course, there's many things we could learn. This is really a question about our being. Like, is there anything missing in you? When you're dropped into this depth of self-contact, into your innate wholeness as a being, nothing's missing. So this really is the resolution of the fixation, because the fixation for each type is actually sensitive to a particular quality of presence. And it's trying to overcompensate for the absence of that quality, or what it believes is the absence of that quality. And when that quality is then realized and embodied in the coaching conversation, all of the constellation, all of the parts that compose the constellation of that fixation actually relax, even if you didn't do parts work with them.
Are you speaking about, when you speak about the particular qualities, you're speaking about what's traditionally called the holy idea?
So you could look at it in terms of what's traditionally called virtues or holy ideas. In Alethia, probably because of my years in the diamond approach, where Almas really so beautifully articulates a variety of qualities of presence, I'm so steeped in that work that I tend to think of it more in those terms, but the concept is similar.
Okay. What sort of Enneagram intervention or Enneagram work is happening at the process depth and at the presence depth?
So at the depth of process, I would say that, we're really there just fully in the particular of what's exactly arising for the client.
Right.
And the thing to understand is there's a radical difference between structure and process. Structure is what dominates at the depth of parts. We're working with structures. Parts are structures. And structures have boundaries to them. They can be differentiated, right? When it comes time to process is this flow. Sometimes I use the metaphor of, imagine standing on the bank of a river, and you're looking at this fast moving water in front of you. And let's say there's an amazing wave that just sort of leaps out of that. And for a moment you say, oh my gosh, look at that. And the second you say that, it's gone already. So that's how process is. So nobody can really describe process in a model.
Okay.
Like if you asked me, what was your felt sense last Wednesday? I have no idea. You could even ask me, what was your felt sense, an hour ago? I have no idea right now. In order for me to have an idea, I would have had to move it from being process into being structure, which is exactly how memories are created. In working with the Enneagram, well-intended coaches are inviting clients to counteract the fixation in a way that generates resistance that then must be overcome in order for the client to develop. I think we see this a lot, especially when that counteractive move is embodied in a practice. To give you a really, really simple example, we see the client maybe moving really quickly, and we invite the client to take up Tai Chi. It's like, okay, let's counteract that. You're so driven, maybe like a driven 3, really a doer. This human doingness of the 3.
Yeah.
And they're out there, they're ambitious, they're driven, they're trying to be efficient, they're trying to really prove their value. and their relationships are suffering. Maybe their health is suffering. A lot of different things can be going on. And we say, let's counteract that with a little Tai Chi to sort of slow them down a little bit. What we're doing there is we're actually trying to resist the fixation, which in return will resist the Tai Chi. Clients tend to not do their practices very regularly. And that's what I mean by invoking resistance that then must be overcome for the client to develop.
Yeah.
If we switch out of that particular view that universal view into the particular, we would work with that ambitious part, that fast driving, fast moving, ambitious part, and say, hey, what are you up to? What's your good intention? And, if I just sort of imagine how that conversation might go, the part may say something like, I'm really trying to help you be valued and be included, right? And this person may have a childhood history where they didn't feel valued. They didn't feel valued in some way by a parent or socially with other children, something like that. And they learned if they just become industrious, they can be the valedictorian and they can have popularity, they can have status, they can have all kinds of things. And that gives them a sense of value. So we could say to that part, I really see how you're trying to help, and I appreciate that. And as that part feels seen and starts to trust the client as presence, that part will relax. So we switch into this kind of view where we're not trying to counteract that part. And what I find is that the development comes much faster, much easier by doing that, as opposed to trying to counteract.
Yeah. So the relaxation itself results in the developmental capacity without us having to shoehorn clients there.
Yeah, exactly. I can remember years of working in a more counteractive style, and just sometimes frustrating and hard it was to feel like that we were getting progress.
Yeah.
Continuing to enroll clients in doing practices. And oftentimes clients would rationally agree.
Yeah.
They would say, yeah, I totally get it. I need to slow down. I need to do it this way. But what we're working with isn't purely rational. It's emotional, and it's what's embodied. And so there could be all kinds of emotional truths at the bottom of this particular pattern that actually have to be given space to, understood, felt in an empathetic, compassionate way, working really in that particular space with that client. So we might learn and catch on to one of these vertical threads of work that from looking at the Enneagram, but working in the particular and then just going back and forth. Extremely powerful.
Yeah. Do you utilize in the back and forth, are you utilizing, say, the lines, the Enneagram's connection points or the wings?
To be honest with you, generally speaking, I don't. I think it's a beautiful part of the model, super helpful if you're trying to type, right? Yeah. To look at the patterns under stress and under integration, under lack of stress. I think that makes a lot of sense. In the end of the day, I'm not a big fan of typing. I see too many people typing and grabbing onto their type as if that's what they are, who they are. Yeah. And I actually really feel like what the real message of the Enneagram is the type is a mistaken identification. It's actually not who we are, because who we are is presence. That's fundamentally what we are. Mm-hmm. And this type, this fixation has arisen as an overcompensation for the apparent absence of presence. And when we actually can do this work to actually relax the fixation through acceptance, love, and appreciation, and drop into deeper contact and realize our true nature, then that dissolves. And I think this is partly explains why people who've done more developmental work often struggle to type themselves. It's not because they don't know themselves, it's because those structures are so soft and malleable. And in fact, every type is sensitive to a particular quality, and every one of us is all of those qualities.
Well, I'm glad that we spoke to then your views on typing. Can you say some about how you see vertical development, or how you hold it in Alethia as well?
Yeah, so vertical development, as we develop it, utilizing the model of the 4 depths. And I should come back and complete that model and give the 4th depth. But utilizing the view of the 4 depths, as we develop, we actually consciously inhabit more of our depth. So the benefit of having a coaching practice where you're practicing inhabiting depth right in the coaching conversation over time is developmental for the client, because they inhabit more and more of their depth. Mm-hmm. So the 4 depths, just to complete that, we have parts, process, presence, and then the deepest depth is the depth of non-duality. And you can can really understand this is a very spiritual depth, of course, and it's a depth that is dominated by non-separation, which is a real contrast to what's happening at the depth of parts, where we see everything as separated. And so as we drop deeper into contact, we drop into this sense of innate resourcefulness, this sense of enoughness. And in fact, the remedy, if you will, to this pervasive sense of deficiency and not enoughness that virtually every human being I've ever met struggles with. When we actually drop in deep and recognize our enoughness, that nothing is missing, that's the remedy to that. And so I make the contrast in this work between self-improvement and self-unfoldment. Many coaching clients come in inside of a self-improvement frame because that's pretty much the only way to understand this in our culture. A self-improvement frame is, in some way, I feel deficient. I feel like I'm not enough right now. And there are parts inside of me with good intentions that want to help me to improve. And those are good intentions, and they need to be honored and recognized for that. But when we act out of a sense of deficiency to try to become sufficient, the tendency is actually to reinforce the sense of deficiency. The alternative to self-improvement is self-unfoldment, where we actually drop deeper in depth and land into innate wholeness. So it's not something that needs to be created by doing. It's more of a shift in our contact with ourselves. You know, in the ideal sense, this is what's happening in something like a meditation practice.
Yeah.
If we have good meditation instruction and we're practicing well and not having our parts dominate our meditation practice, we will spontaneously drop deeper and land into these deep depths. The challenge is that most of us are just struggling with parts that are triggered left and right, that want to improve the experience or change the experience in some way, or that are convinced we're no good at this. For this reason, I sometimes call Alethia coaching mindfulness for two.
Right.
It's like what we're practicing in the coaching conversation is a little bit like a contemplative practice, where we're actually working with what's here, noticing the parts that are getting triggered, and then carefully and slowly just working deeper and deeper and deeper.
Are you using your own body and your own presence to discern where the client is on that continuum?
Absolutely. Yeah. In fact, you can look at the coaching relationship itself from the perspective of these four depths.
Your coaches have to be really refined vehicles, don't they? Really developed in themselves in order to be able to practice this method.
Well, I think it's a progressive thing. I think practicing the method is what develops this refinement.
Yeah.
You know, so they don't have to have it before practicing the method, but practicing this method, and we start in our trainings, and we, you know, in level 1, we introduce parts work, and we spend a lot of time working with polarizations, the different configurations that parts can take. We introduce process work, then we introduce presence work, and we slowly just take our coaches deeper and deeper, helping them sort of opening up a new depth, a new horizon of depth that they can work with, and slowly just working down through that. And of course, they're doing their own work with themselves, with their own parts.
And your teaching is the Enneagram at the parts stage as a mirror.
I don't really teach the Enneagram in the classes. What I do is I basically say, if you want to work with the Enneagram, here's how to do that inside the Alethia method.
Cool.
Right. And it's really literally what I've just shared with you in the example that I gave of the CEO.
Yeah.
We can use the method, help the client look in that mirror, see something about themselves that perhaps they were blind to. Right. That's really the benefit of structural approaches. All structural approaches to coaching rest in the assumption that all of us have cognitive blindness, which is true, we do. And for that reason, it's so helpful to look in a kind of mirror. Now, sometimes a model can be a mirror, and sometimes another person can be a mirror. We as coaches can say, you know, we've been working for a while, and there's something I'd like to share that I'm observing that I think is relevant to the issue, you know, so we can mirror that back to the client. And both things need to happen. We can use the Enneagram as that mirror, we can mirror it back ourselves. But then once we work with that, we have to work with what that brings to the surface. Because sometimes you've probably seen this with your own work, the Enneagram. Client may be reading something about their type and suddenly feel shame.
Yeah. weaponizes superego massively. It's a big problem.
Exactly. The superego gets triggered, the inner critic gets triggered. And so it's like, actually, what you have to do is put down the model at that point, turn into the particular, turn to that superego part and say, hi.
I'm so glad that you've said that. That is so important.
Yeah. And to relate to that part from presence with the understanding that that part is trying to help you. It's important to understand that all parts have a positive intention, but it's equally important to understand that parts have a negative unintended side effect.
Yeah.
So the positive intention of an inner critic part may not be as readily available as the negative unintended side effect, because we feel criticized and we feel deficient, we feel not enough. Yeah. And of course, we want to be free from that. Like, stop that. Don't do that to me. Don't criticize me so harshly. And yet what we have to understand is that's a counteractive change agenda. And it's actually a change agenda coming from another part.
Right.
Parts are trying to, out of their good intentions, change other parts. And this is how the whole thing inside of us gets stuck, because we have parts that are well-intended, but trying to change other parts that are resisting that change because they don't feel seen and understood for their good intentions. So presence is the catalyst for unfoldment. Presence is the aspect of us that can be in the middle of that conversation and actually begin to slowly unstuck, get us unstuck out of that frozenness, but never from the perspective of a change agenda. In Gestalt psychology, they call this the paradox of change. Paradox of change is if you try to change an aspect of yourself, what you will get back is resistance. But if you just approach that aspect of yourself with the deep, genuine desire to understand it, emotionally understand it, and have that feel seen, what you get back is change. And so working in the particular is actually leveraging that paradox.
Yeah. Steve, how do you facilitate that sort of presence with, let's just say the inner critic, presence with the part?
So I think this is one of the jobs of the coach. At the very beginning, the coach is a surrogate presence in the sense that the client may be triggered in all kinds of different ways. They're looking at something, they have an inner critic, etc. They might not have much access to presence, especially at the beginning of their developmental journey as adults. Presence is almost, virtually unknown to them.
Yeah.
That there's an aspect of them that feels whole and complete. All they know are these parts that are emotionally reactive. So we have to be that presence to start with. And we can start, and this is part of the coaching methodology, is to actually help clients to begin to relate to what they're experiencing in terms of, there's a part of you that is feeling ashamed. There's a part of you that's angry. There's a part of you that's sad. There's a part of you that's criticizing you. What if we turn to that part? And so starting to actually name these parts begins to create a kind of space to be with the parts. Okay. And that space to be with the parts is the opening to presence.
Yeah,
right.
That's really clear, yeah.
So the thing to get is that the unfolding kind of change is fundamental to life. It's been operating really from our conception. It's been the kind of change that helped us grow as children. Except in this culture that we live in, we've almost forgotten about this kind of unfolding change. And instead, we've taken on the belief that the only change that can happen is as a result of actions we take.
Yeah.
And the actions that we take, when we view it in that way, it tends to be more mechanistic. View things as broken, like people as broken, myself, ourselves as broken, ourselves as deficient in some way, and we must take action to repair or take action to improve. And it's not that nothing comes of that, but it's very problematic in a number of ways, very mixed results. We tend to never be able to escape the gravity of self-deficiency. And we're not leveraging this other kind of change, this unfolding kind of change, which is so spontaneous and just simply manifests through aliveness itself, right? Yeah. So a lot of what I'm doing with Alethia coaching methodology is trying to bring unfolding change back into view and to help coaches and clients actually be able to leverage that as opposed to just this self-improvement kind of change. Yeah. And what we find is that the results are more powerful and it takes less effort. It's less effort for the coach and it's less effort for the client. Mostly it's less effort because we avoid activating the resistances that the self-improvement or counteractive approach will activate. So if we don't activate those resistances and we're leveraging a kind of change that's simply unfolding from aliveness, everything seems to flow more easily. And that's, I think that's the real opportunity between marrying something like an unfolding method like Alethia with the Enneagram. The Enneagram has all this strength of view and detail, and it's so helpful to study these different types because it helps us to understand human nature and how other people can function inwardly and experience inwardly in a way that's so different from us, and yet completely consistent within their view. That's such an important thing for coaches to get.
Yeah.
I don't know of anything better than the Enneagram for learning that, getting that. But we have to then work in the particular.
Yeah.
And really utilizing this kind of unfolding process, which it's my understanding was actually Oscar Ichazo's original way of working, was not so much in this counteractive style, was actually using this view and what he called trialectics. Trialectics is a difficult thing to understand, I think, mostly because it hasn't been well articulated. But it's my understanding that that's exactly how he originally used this.
I guess you don't work with the instincts, the Enneagram instincts, in a sort of direct way.
So inside of non-dual work, when we get to that depth and I train coaches and we go through that, it's really important to work with the instincts at that point.
At the non-dual point.
Yeah, at the non-dual point. It's really important to work with the instincts at that point because the instincts are so fundamental in us. And the root of many of those, the root of all of these instincts is separation. So in order to actually fully embody and land into non-dual realization, you have to work with all of the different aspects inside of your psychology that has separation as its basis. So I don't work with instincts necessarily in usual coaching conversations. I do have clients take the instincts test. I'm forgetting the name of it off the top of my head at the Enneagram Institute while they take the RETI test. I do have them take that. I take it as information to notice perhaps their self-pres or social or sexual. It's background information for me, but I really don't lean into that. Try to find, let's say, the part of them that is social. I don't find parts mapped to instinct. They map more to fixations.
Right.
So I'm more just looking at, the results, the types, and the descriptions of the fixations and finding the constellations of parts.
You don't have maybe a small example of how that looks, Steve?
Well, essentially, you could think of it like you have to spiritualize the instincts. And the instincts are all rooted in the body. The instincts are deep within the body. The way that we approach non-dual work in Alethia is we actually have 4 different styles of non-dual work that we work through in a kind of developmental progression. The first is a kind of unfolding or gradual unfoldment. Non-dual realization is a gradual unfoldment. The second is the path of sudden awakening, using emptiness meditations and insight to suddenly awaken see-through constructions. The third path is the path of embodied realization, and that's really where we have to work with the instincts to actually, in a way, reconstruct the body to be one that supports and anchors non-dual realization in the world as you're living, as opposed to having the body, for example, be something that separates us, right? So like I said, when you're working with non-dual work, because non-duality is non-separateness, you really become a connoisseur of all the different ways that we experience separation. And you have to work through those. The last approach is the path of profound illumination. And in a way, you could look at these. The first is an unfolding depth approach. The second is a mind approach. The third is a body approach. And the final one is a heart approach. And so even utilizing the 3 centers in non-dual work and noticing that there are different approaches to non-dual work. Some of those approaches some people will gravitate to more than others. Some people might gravitate more to a mind approach or a heart approach or a body approach.
Really interesting. Is there anything that I haven't asked you that's important to know about the approach Alethia take to working with the Enneagram or using the Enneagram?
Nothing really comes to mind. I mean, there is a lot in Alethia, and at the same time, what I I hold Alethea to be a next generation advanced method. I
Mm.
really feel like we're working in a detailed way, in a particular way with clients that's extremely skillful. And yet over and over, I hear feedback from, and it mirrors my own experience of the ease of it.
Mm.
And I think this is a really interesting approach. When we start to leverage this unfolding change, which is already happening, it's more a matter of trying to align to it and then just notice, well, what's here, what's happening, what's unfolding. That there's sophistication, but also ease in this. And to some, that's surprising at first.
Yeah.
I like Heinz Kohut's distinction between approaches that are experience near and experience far, or experience distant, I think was his exact distinction. And he was the founder of self-psychology. So he was coming out of the psychoanalytic school, very Freudian, but kind of moved in his own direction. And he noticed that there were methodologies that were distant from experience. These would be akin to coaching approaches that are focused on assessment and design, where we do an intake, we go home, we use models, we assess, we try to understand the client, we come up with a design, something we want to propose to the client, we come back with this beautiful offer, well designed, etc. There can be really beautiful coaching that happens in that kind of way, for sure, but there is oftentimes an activation of resistance. Clients struggle to do practices. There's a big time change agenda inside of that kind of coaching, because that's the basis of the design. Design is to get the client from point A to point B, however you imagine that, right? Yeah. Experience near approaches are just working with exactly what's here, centered on relationship.
Yeah.
So I think the coaching field in general does need to move more into experience near approaches, just as the psychotherapy field has largely.
Thank you. Seems like a good way to park our exploration for now. Thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thank you. It was fun to share this, and I love what you're up to. I think it's such a gift for the coaching community overall. So thank you for your work.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. I hope that you enjoyed that incredibly profound interview. My next guest is one of the only teachers of object relations and the Enneagram material out there, to my knowledge, Belinda Gore. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and leave a review if you feel like it.